The fence post split clean down the middle. The morning Albert Carson said the words that would change everything Jane Grady had ever believed about men, about the land, and about the locked and shuttered chambers of her own grieving heart. She had come to the boundary line because the cattle were pushing through again, because 3 of her white-faced heifers had wandered into the tall grass of the Carson property at dawn, and because Jane Grady did not send hired hands to do the work she could do with her own 2 hands. She had pulled on her boots before the sun was fully above the mesa, knotted her dark hair beneath her hat, and ridden out on her gray mare with a coil of wire and a pair of pliers hanging from the saddle horn. She was 27 years old, a widow of 8 months, and she had learned in those 8 months that the land did not pause for grief, that the cattle did not rest for mourning, and that no man in the county of Torrance, New Mexico territory, was going to let a woman rancher hold her ground without a fight. She had not expected Albert Carson to already be there. He stood on his side of the down section of fence, his hat in one hand and the other pressed flat against the split post, like he was steadying himself against something invisible. He was tall in the way of men who had worked hard since boyhood, broad across the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting at horizons for too many years. He was 34 years old, and he had run the Carson ranch alone since his father walked into the desert one summer and never came back. She knew these facts the way you knew facts about neighbors in a place where neighbors were few and far between, and gossip traveled faster than the wind off the Sandia Mountains. What she did not know was why Albert Carson was standing at that fence with his hat off, and something raw and barely contained moving across his face like a storm front she had not seen coming. She pulled the mare up short, and their eyes met across the broken wire. He said, low and rough and entirely without warning, "I have planted this field 20 seasons and never cared like today." Jane Grady felt the words land on her like a physical thing, not because they were pretty words, though they were. Not because she had been starved for gentleness, though she had been, terribly, quietly starved for it, but because she understood in one blazing and terrible instant that he was not talking about the field. He was looking directly at her with those weather-lined eyes, and the morning light was coming hard and gold across the grass between them, and he was talking about her. And she was not ready. She was not even close to ready. And the betrayal she felt was not of him, but of herself, of the careful wall she had built around everything soft inside her since she had buried Thomas Grady in November. She yanked the mare's head around and rode back toward her own property without a word, and Albert Carson stood at the broken fence and watched her go, and neither of them knew yet how deep the roots of this thing had already grown, or what dark secrets and forced choices and ultimate sacrifices were still waiting for them both in the red soil of that borderland between their 2 lives. But we have to go back. We have to understand what the land was before that morning, and what these 2 people were before they became the kind of people who stood at a fence and said true things to each other. We have to understand Thomas Grady's death, and the hidden motives of Marcus Hale, and the trap that had been set long before Jane arrived in Torrance County. And we have to understand what Albert Carson had been doing for 20 seasons in that field that finally, on that ordinary dawn, meant something more than crops. Jane Grady had come to New Mexico territory in the spring of 1878, 19 years old and newly married to Thomas Grady, who was 31 and full of the reckless optimism that characterized so many men who came west with a little money and a large dream. Thomas was not a bad man. She had loved him in the straightforward way of a girl who had grown up in a Missouri farmhouse with practical parents and practical expectations about marriage. He was funny and warm, and he worked hard, and he had a temper that only appeared rarely and never turned itself toward her. She had been content. She had not expected or wanted the kind of love that consumed you. She had wanted the kind that sustained you, and for 8 years, that was what she had. The Grady Ranch sat on 340 acres in the valley, southeast of the town of Cimarron, in the rolling grassland that bled into mesa country. Thomas had built the main house himself with hired help, and had planted corn in the south field the first season, and run longhorns on the grazed land to the north. Jane had taken charge of the kitchen garden, the chickens, the household accounts, and the training of the 2 dogs that served as their only security through many a long dark night when Thomas was on the range and the coyotes came circling. She had been useful and capable, and she had known exactly who she was and what her life was, and that was its own kind of happiness. The Carson ranch bordered theirs to the west. Albert Carson had inherited it 4 years before the Gradys arrived. He had been 20 years old when his father disappeared, and he had been alone on that property ever since, with a small rotating crew of cowhands who came and went with the seasons. In the early years, Jane and Thomas had seen him rarely. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly but not given to socializing, and when he came to town for supplies he was polite and brief and disappeared again. Thomas liked him well enough. They had a standing agreement about the fence line and the water rights to the creek that ran between their properties, and they had honored that agreement without incident for 8 years, which in that part of New Mexico was nearly a kind of friendship. Jane had thought of Albert Carson when she thought of him at all as part of the landscape, the way you thought of the mesa, the way you thought of the creek, present, reliable, not requiring your consideration. That assessment began to change in the summer of 1884, a year before everything fell apart. A dry summer, the driest in memory, the kind that turns decent grassland to cracked earth and sends cattle to their knees at dried-up watering holes. The creek between the Grady and Carson properties shrank to a trickle. Thomas, who was not good in crisis, and who had a habit of meeting hardship with whiskey rather than problem-solving, spent 3 days in Cimarron doing business of the liquid variety, while Jane drove herself and their 2 cowhands to the edge of exhaustion, trying to move the herd to the north pasture, where there was still some green. It was Albert Carson who appeared at their gate on the 3rd day of Thomas's absence with 3 of his own men and a proposition. He had found a spring on the high ground of his western pasture, he said, standing at the gate with his hat in his hand, addressing Jane because Thomas was not there to be addressed. It was putting out enough water to share if they wanted to bring her cattle up through the Carson land to drink. No charge, neighbor helping neighbor, that was all. Jane had looked at him for a long moment in the hard summer light. She was 25 years old and sunburned and tired, and she had been carrying the weight of the ranch for 3 days with no help from the man she had married. And here was this quiet neighbor offering assistance without any visible expectation of return, and something in her recognized the rarity of that even as she was too exhausted to be gracious about it. She said yes. She thanked him. She brought her cattle through his land for 5 days while the creek recovered. They spoke perhaps 24 sentences to each other over those 5 days, practical sentences about water levels and cattle counts and the behavior of the sky. But at the end of the 5th day, when the creek was running again and she came to tell him she would not need to use his spring anymore, he said something she did not forget. He said, very quietly, "You ran a good operation here this week, Mrs. Grady. Your husband is a lucky man." He said it without any edge, without any commentary on where Thomas had been or what he had been doing, just the plain statement. And Jane had nodded and ridden home, and had not examined the warmth the words left in her chest, because she was a practical woman, and she had a life to get back to. Thomas came home 2 days after the cattle were sorted out. He was contrite, the way he was always contrite after these episodes, full of remorse and promises. Jane accepted his apology the way she had learned to accept these apologies, which was to say she put them away in a drawer and did not look at them too closely. This was the dark past of her marriage that she told no one, the truth that Thomas Grady was a good man when he was good and an absent one when he was not, and that the gaps between his goodness had been growing longer with each passing year. The summer drought passed. The year turned. And Thomas Grady, in the autumn of 1885, went to Cimarron for supplies and did not come back. They found him 2 days later at the bottom of a draw north of town. His horse had thrown him, or so the county sheriff determined, and he had struck his head on a rock and died. And that was the official story, and the story that Jane had to live inside of. Whether it was entirely the truth was a question that nagged at her in the sleepless hours of the nights that followed, because Thomas had been in debt to a man named Marcus Hale, a rancher and moneylender who operated out of a limestone office on the main street of Cimarron, with the authority of a man who believed the law was merely a suggestion for people less powerful than himself. Marcus Hale was not a man with obvious villainy. He was 52 years old and dressed well and spoke with the measured calm of someone who had never needed to raise his voice, because the weight of his money did his threatening for him. He had loaned Thomas Grady $2,000 3 years prior to expand the cattle operation, and Thomas had not managed the money well, and the debt had grown with interest, until it stood at something closer to $3,000 at the time of Thomas's death, a figure that represented most of the value of the Grady ranch. Hale came to see Jane 6 days after Thomas was buried. He sat across from her at her own kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had made him, and explained the situation in the reasonable tones of a man delivering unfortunate news he had no part in creating. The debt was owed by the estate. The ranch would need to be sold to satisfy it unless she had another means of payment. He was sorry for her loss, naturally. He said this last thing with an expression that communicated no sorrow whatsoever. Jane listened to all of this without speaking and then asked him politely to leave her property. He went, because there was nothing immediately actionable and because Hale was a patient man. But he sent a lawyer to formalize the demand 2 weeks later, and the lawyer made it very clear that Jane had perhaps 3 months, maybe 4, before the legal machinery began to move against her. This was the trap. This was the forced choice. Sell the land that she had poured 8 years of her life into, or find a way to pay a debt she had never made, and could not hope to clear on a widow's income from a ranch that barely broke even in a good year. It was during the 2nd week after Thomas's death, when Jane was barely sleeping and eating only when her body demanded it, and spending her days in a mechanical performance of ranch work, because movement was the only thing keeping the grief and panic from swallowing her whole, that Albert Carson appeared at her fence again. He was not there for any dramatic reason. The wire had gone down in a section near the south field, and he came to tell her in case she had not noticed, in case her cattle were at risk of wandering. He stood at the fence line and he told her this, and he asked if she needed any help with the repair. His voice was careful and his eyes were careful, and she understood that he was trying not to make her feel weak by offering help, and also that he genuinely meant it. She told him no. She thanked him. She fixed the fence herself that afternoon. But the exchange had loosened something. Over the weeks that followed, Albert Carson appeared at the fence or at her gate with gradually increasing frequency, always with a reason, always with something practical to offer. A spare roll of wire he did not need. Information about a cattle buyer coming through the county. The name of a lawyer in Santa Fe who was known to be fair. He never lingered. He never pressed. He came, offered his practical thing, and went. Jane was not naive. She was a woman who had learned to read men's motives because her survival had depended on it, and she could see clearly enough what this was. Albert Carson had feelings for her. The signs were there in the careful way he held himself when he spoke to her, in the way his eyes stayed on her face a moment longer than was strictly necessary, in the particular quality of his attention, which was the kind of attention that costs something to give and is not handed out carelessly. She should have been clear with him. She told herself she would be clear with him. She was 8 months from her husband's grave, and she was fighting for her land, and she had no room and no heart for whatever this was. And yet she found herself walking to the fence sometimes in the late afternoon when the work was done, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and if his truck was visible in the far field, She felt something in her chest that she worked very hard not to name. The situation with Marcus Hale was worsening. The lawyer's second letter arrived in January of 1886, more specific about timelines and legal remedies. Jane had managed to scrape together $300 from the cattle sales of autumn, but it was barely a tenth of what was owed, and Hale's interest rate was predatory. She had begun to understand that the debt Thomas had taken on was structured in a way that was designed to fail, that the terms had been written by Hale's lawyer in language that sounded reasonable but operated as a trap, and that Thomas had either not understood this when he signed or had understood it and had been too proud or too desperate to tell her. The hidden motive behind Hale's patience began to clarify in late January, when she learned through the particular grapevine of small western towns that Hale had been offering to buy the Carson ranch for 2 years, and that Albert Carson had refused him twice. The Carson property was the piece Hale wanted most. It controlled the best water access in the valley and sat at the junction of 2 cattle trails that were worth real money. But Albert would not sell, and Albert's credit was solid and his operation was sound, and Hale had no lever against him. The Grady Ranch, however, shared a border with the Carson property. If Hale acquired the Grady land, he would have the leverage he needed over the water access, and he could potentially force Carson out of business within 2 seasons by controlling the creek flow that both properties depended on. Jane Grady was not a piece in someone else's game. She did not become that way after learning this. She became more determined. She rode into Cimarron in the first week of February, with the cold coming off the mountains sharp as a knife blade, and she went to the land office and spent 4 hours reading documents she barely had the legal training to interpret, and she came out knowing 2 things. First, that the debt instrument Hale held was legally binding, and she had no immediate way to challenge it without money she did not have. Second, that there was a clause in the original land grant for the Grady property that had never been properly filed, a technical error in the 1878 transfer of title, which meant the deed was potentially contestable. She went back to the ranch and she wrote a letter to the lawyer in Santa Fe whose name Albert Carson had given her. And that evening she rode to the fence in the last of the winter light, and she stood there until Albert Carson appeared across the wire, which he did within minutes as if he had been watching for her, and she said without preamble, "Tell me what you know about Marcus Hale and why he wants my land." Albert was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to her side of the fence. He had never done that before, always maintained the respectful distance of the property line between them, and his crossing of it now felt significant in a way that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with the invisible line between neighbors and something more. He told her everything he knew. His voice was level and thorough, and he held nothing back. Hale had been buying up the valley piece by piece for 3 years. He had the county commissioner in his pocket, and possibly the sheriff as well, which was why the investigation into Thomas's death had been so brief and so conclusive. There were 2 other families who had lost land to Hale through similar debt arrangements, both of them gone now, relocated to Colorado or California, their stories absorbed into the general misfortune of frontier life, where bad luck and bad men were often indistinguishable from each other. Albert said, "He won't get your land, Jane." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it the way you notice a door opening that you did not know was closed. She said, "You don't get to promise that." He said, "No, but I can work toward it." She rode home in the dark, and she lay awake for a very long time thinking about a man who crossed a fence line and spoke in the language of intention rather than guarantee. And she thought about how rare that was, and how dangerous. The lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named Edward Fuentes who had spent 20 years arguing land cases in New Mexico territory, and knew every clause of the Territorial Land Act better than he knew his own children, wrote back within 2 weeks. He had reviewed the information Jane sent him about the original land grant, and he agreed that the filing error created a genuine legal question. It would not be a fast process and it would not be a certain one, but it was something to work with. His fee was substantial. Jane did not have it. She was sitting at the kitchen table with his letter and her account book and a pencil when she heard the knock at her door. It was late in the evening, too late for a social call, and her first instinct was fear, because in those months she had learned to be afraid of knocks at night. She went to the door with Thomas's old Colt revolver held behind her back. It was Albert Carson. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hand, which she had noticed was something he always did when he was being serious, and he said he was sorry for the hour, and he would leave if she said so, but he had heard something in town that day that she needed to know. She put the gun on the sideboard and let him in. He told her that Marcus Hale had approached the county judge about accelerating the debt proceedings. He had been in the judge's house for 2 hours that afternoon. Albert had seen him go in and seen him come out, and 2 hours with a judge meant money had changed hands or pressure had been applied or both. Whatever timeline Fuentes in Santa Fe was working on, it might just have gotten shorter. Jane sat across from him at the same table where Hale had sat months before, and she looked at this man in her kitchen, this quiet neighbor with his worn hands and his careful eyes, and she felt something shift in her chest that she had been bracing against for weeks. Not desire, not exactly, not yet, though that was there in the back of it like heat held behind glass. Something more fundamental. Trust. The dangerous, inconvenient, unsought sensation of trusting someone you had not planned to trust. She said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because it's right," and because he started again. "I'll let that be enough for now." She wanted to push. She did not push. She was not ready for what was on the other side of that incomplete sentence. She said, "I need to pay Fuentes. I need about $200 to retain him and keep him working the case." Albert said without hesitation, "I have it." She started to say no. He said, "Don't. This isn't charity and it isn't sentiment. If Hale gets your land, he controls the creek on 2 sides of mine. I have practical reasons and I have the money. Let it be a loan if that's easier to accept." She accepted it as a loan, with terms they wrote out by hand at her kitchen table in the lamplight, and it was the most businesslike and also the most intimate thing she had done in 8 months of widowhood, because there was Albert Carson's handwriting next to hers on the page, and his presence filled her kitchen in a way she had not allowed herself to notice until now. He left before 9. She did not sleep well. Fuentes received the funds and began in earnest. He was corresponding with the land office in Santa Fe and the original surveyor's records from 1878, and he believed he could build a case that would at minimum buy Jane another year before Hale could move against her. Meanwhile, Jane hired 2 additional hands for the spring work and threw herself into the cattle operation with the focused intensity of someone who has decided that losing is not an option and is willing to work herself to the edge of collapse to prove it. March came in hard, with cold rain that turned the south field to mud and made the roads to town nearly impassable for a week. On the 3rd day of the rainstorm, one of Jane's horses went down with colic, and she was in the barn at midnight trying to walk him through it when she heard hooves in the yard and looked up to find Albert Carson standing in the barn doorway with water streaming off his hat brim and his expression communicating that he had seen her lamp on, and stopped without needing more reason than that. He stayed in the barn for 4 hours, walking the horse on the other side while she walked him on hers, and they talked. Not about Hale or lawyers or land. They talked about real things. She told him about Missouri and her parents' farm and what it had felt like to come west as a bride and see the scale of this landscape for the first time, the way it had seemed simultaneously like freedom and like the edge of the world. He told her about his father, the mystery of his disappearance, the way a 20-year-old boy becomes a man overnight when there is no one else to do it, and the loneliness of the years that followed, the loneliness he had filled with work and seasons and the particular satisfaction of growing things. He said, "I plant the south field every spring. Corn mostly, some sorghum. I started the first year after my father left because I needed something to tend that wasn't cattle, something that required me to stay still in one place and pay attention. He paused. Some years that was the only thing that kept me anchored here, Jane said. Have you ever wanted to leave? He looked at her across the horse they were walking between them and he said, there were years I was restless enough to walk away from anything, but something always kept me. I used to think it was the land. He did not say what he thought it was now. He did not have to. The horse recovered as the sky was beginning to pale and they stood in the barn doorway looking out at the mud and the thinning rain, and there was a silence between them that was full of everything they were not yet saying. She said, you should get home before full light. He said, yes. He did not move immediately. Neither did she. Then he put his hat on and walked out through the mud to his horse and rode west, and Jane stood in the barn doorway watching him go, and felt the particular ache of wanting something you are not certain you are permitted to want. Spring deepened. Fuentes sent word from Santa Fe that he had found a secondary document in the surveyor's records that substantially strengthened their position regarding the title defect. He was ready to file a formal challenge to the debt collection proceedings, which would halt Hale's legal action while the title question was adjudicated. It would not resolve everything, but it would buy time, and time was what Jane needed to build the cattle operation to a point where she could approach a bank in Albuquerque about refinancing the debt on legitimate terms. Hale responded to the filing with what Jane could only describe as controlled fury. He appeared at her gate on a Thursday morning in late April, this time without the pretense of reasonable tones. He stood at her gate and told her that contesting his claim was a mistake she would regret, that Fuentes was a legal irritant and nothing more, and that the prudent course was to sell now at a fair price and begin her life elsewhere. Jane stood on her porch with her arms crossed and her face composed, and she said, Mr. Hale, I will not be selling. Not today, and not when your lawyer files his next motion, and not after that. You are welcome to pursue the legal remedies available to you, and I will pursue mine, and we will let the territorial courts decide the matter. Good day. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not anger exactly, but something colder than anger, the expression of a man who respects an opponent without intending to lose to one. Then he tipped his hat and rode out. Jane went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and shook for approximately 2 minutes. Then she stood up and went back to work. She told Albert about the confrontation that evening at the fence. She had begun to come to the fence in the late afternoon the way she might have gone to a well, knowing something sustaining was there. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said, He'll escalate. She said, I know. He said, I want you to know that I've written to the Cattlemen's Association in Santa Fe about his practices. If there are enough complaints from credible ranchers, the territorial governor's office has reason to investigate. It takes time, she said. Everything takes time. He leaned against the fence post, looking out across her south field where the spring grass was coming in green and thick after the rain, and he said something that surprised her. He said, my father used to say that patience was the only crop that never failed. I thought that was a foolish thing to say when I was 20. I believe it now. She looked at him looking at her field and she said, What made you stay, Albert? You said the land used to be the reason. What is it now? He turned his head and looked at her, and for once his expression was not careful. For once she could see through it to what was underneath, and what was underneath was the kind of feeling that does not develop in weeks or months but in years of proximity and small moments and quiet accumulated knowledge of another person. He said, You know what it is. She said, Say it plainly. He said, I'm in love with you, Jane. I have been for longer than is probably decent to admit. I stayed because you are on the other side of that fence and I did not want to be somewhere else. The field was gold in the late afternoon light. Her mare was standing at the water trough. Somewhere on the Carson property, a crow was making its comment about the day. Jane Grady stood at the fence line between their two lives and felt the wall she had built in November begin to come apart in a way she had known was coming but had not been willing to name. She said, "It's too soon." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not finished grieving." He said, "I know that too. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth because you asked for plain speech and I think you deserve it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I have not been entirely honest with myself about what I feel when you come to this fence." He was very still. She said, "I am not ready, but I am not indifferent, and I need you to know that." He nodded once slowly, and there was something in his face that was relief and pain in equal measure, the expression of a man who has been carrying a secret for a long time and has set it down at last in a place where it might be safe. He said, "That's enough for now." Summer arrived with its full force, baking the valley floor and pushing the temperature in the main house above 90 degrees by noon most days. Jane worked through it in the practical, competent way that had become her trademark among the ranchers of Torrance County. The word had gotten around, the way word does in small western communities, that Jane Grady was fighting Marcus Hale's debt claim and fighting it well, and there was a current of quiet admiration running through the county for that, because Hale had taken land from people before, and no one had ever pushed back. Fuentes's challenge was working its way through the territorial court system with the agonizing slowness of legal processes in 1886 New Mexico. But it was working. The county judge whom Hale had visited in February had recused himself from the case after Fuentes raised questions about his impartiality, and a replacement had been appointed from Socorro, who was not in anyone's pocket as far as anyone could tell. This was not nothing. This was progress of the careful, incremental kind that Jane had learned to recognize and value. In July, the Cattlemen's Association responded to Albert's letter with a formal inquiry into Hale's lending practices, and 2 additional ranchers in the county came forward with their own accounts of debt arrangements that had been structured to fail. The territorial governor's office was now aware of Hale's pattern of behavior. This was still not justice, but it was the outline of justice becoming visible on the horizon, and it was enough to sustain you if you were the kind of person Jane Grady was. Through the long summer, she and Albert continued their fence-line conversations, which had become the organizing rhythm of her days in a way she had stopped pretending was merely practical. He brought her information when he had it and helped when help was needed, and kept his declared feelings at a respectful distance that honored her request for time. But the distance was closing, incrementally, the way ground is covered when you are not watching your feet. One evening in August they were both at the fence when a storm came up from the south without warning, the way summer storms in New Mexico do. A wall of black cloud moving fast across the mesa while the air pressure dropped and the horses grew nervous. She had cattle in the south field that needed moving and he had cattle in his near pasture, and they both looked at the sky, and then at each other, and then without a word began to work toward the same ends from opposite sides of the fence. They moved the cattle together through 2 hours of lightning and driving rain, her hands and his working the same herd from different angles, calling to each other across the noise of the storm, with the shorthand of people who understood each other's intentions without needing to spell them out. By the time the herd was in, and the storm was cresting and then breaking over the mesa to the north, they were both soaked through and standing in her barn doorway, and she was laughing. She had not laughed since before Thomas died. The sound surprised her. It surprised him too. He looked at her laughing in the lamplight of the barn with rain streaming off both of them, and his expression was so open and unguarded that she had to look away, because looking at it directly felt like looking at something sacred that was not yet hers to look at. He said very quietly, "There you are." She looked back at him. She said, "What?" He said, "I used to see you laugh before, when Thomas was alive. You laughed differently then. This is how you laugh when you're just yourself." She was very still. Then she said, "I didn't know you were watching." He said, "I wasn't watching the way that sounds. I just paid attention. There's a difference." She said, "I know there is." The rain dripped from the barn roof. Her mare blew softly in her stall. Jane Grady stood in the lamplight and looked at Albert Carson and understood, with the clear, practical, grieving, still learning to hope part of her mind, that she was falling in love with this man, and that it was not a betrayal of Thomas, and that it was not recklessness, and that it was the most terrifying thing she had felt in years. She said, "You should stay for supper. It's late to ride back in this." He said, "All right." They ate together at her kitchen table, the two of them and the lamplight and the last of the rain outside, and they talked through the evening about everything and nothing, about the cattle operation and the legal case and the price of beef and the way the territorial government was changing and what statehood might eventually mean for land rights and water law. And underneath all of that practical talk was another conversation happening in the spaces between words, a conversation about what they were to each other and what they might become. He left at 9. He did not touch her. But at the door he paused and turned back and looked at her for a moment with those careful, warm, entirely serious eyes and said, "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Thank you for the cattle work." He almost smiled. He said, "That's not what I meant," she said. "I know it isn't." He went. She closed the door and stood with her back against it and let herself feel, fully and without apology, what she was feeling. September brought a turn in the Hale situation that was uglier than anything that had come before. One of Jane's hands, a young man named Roy who had been with her since spring, came to her one morning looking pale and told her he had been approached in town by two men who worked for Hale, not the office kind of workers but the other kind, the kind who communicated with their physical presence and the implicit weight of what they might do. They had told Roy that people who worked for stubborn women who made trouble for important men sometimes found themselves unemployed and worse. Jane sent Roy and her other hand, an older man named Pete who had been loyal to the property since Thomas's time, to stay in town for a week. She told them she was not running them off and she would pay them through their absence, but she wanted them clear of whatever was coming. Then she rode to Albert Carson's ranch for the first time since she had known him and knocked on his front door. He answered the door with his sleeves rolled up and an expression that moved through surprise to concern in the space of a second. He brought her inside. She told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, and then he said, "You're not staying there alone." She said, "I am not leaving my ranch." He said, "I'm not asking you to leave it. I'm asking you to stay here." She looked at him. He said with great care and perfect correctness, "I have a spare room. Nothing more than that. You can see your property from my east window and I can ride over with you every morning for the work. But you should not be alone in that house until this passes." She stayed. For a week, she slept in Albert Carson's spare room and rode out to her ranch every morning with him beside her and worked her land through the day and came back to his house in the evening. And the particular intimacy of this domestic proximity was its own kind of revelation. She learned who he was in the spaces of daily life, the way he was organized and precise in his kitchen, the way he sat on his front porch in the evening and read whatever books he could get from the lending library in Cimarron, the way he never raised his voice to his hands, and the way his hands worked for him with genuine loyalty in return. She learned that he was funny, dryly and quietly funny, in the way of people who are not performing humor, but simply seeing it everywhere they look. She learned that he had a habit of getting up before dawn and going to the south field to check the corn, and on the third morning she got up at the same hour and went with him, and they walked through the field in the blue pre-dawn light with dew on everything, and he told her about the 20 seasons he had planted it and how each year was different, how the land taught you something new if you were paying attention, how patience and attention were the only things farming really required of you, and how those same two things were also the hardest things to give. He stopped in the middle of the field and looked down at the corn that was still standing though the season was turning, and he said, very quietly, the thing she had not yet understood the full weight of, "I have planted this field 20 seasons and never cared like today." She turned to look at him. He looked at her, not at the corn, not at the field, at her, and she understood completely and finally what all 20 seasons had been for and why today was different, and she felt it in her chest like a door coming fully open. She said, "Albert," he said. "I know," she said. "I am done being afraid of this." He said nothing. He waited, because he was a man who had waited long enough to know how to do it without anxiety. She stepped toward him through the corn and took his face in her hands, which were brown and strong from 8 years of ranch work, and she looked at him the way she had not let herself look at him across a fence line, directly and without apology, and with everything she was feeling visible in her face. She kissed him. There in the south field with the corn around them, and the dawn beginning to come, and the dew on everything, and 20 seasons of waiting in the ground beneath their feet. He kissed her back with the careful intensity of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is now fully present, and his hands came up to hold her, not dramatically but solidly, the way you hold something precious and real. And the field was very quiet, and the world was very large, and Jane Grady had not known, until that moment, how much she had needed this particular thing. They stood there for a long time in the cornfield. Then they walked back to the house together, and he made coffee and she made breakfast, and they did not speak about what had happened with any more words than were necessary, because neither of them were people who needed words for things that were already understood. The legal situation broke in October in a way that was decisive and almost anticlimactic after so many months of tension. The territorial court ruled that the title defect in the original Grady land grant was substantive enough to invalidate the 1883 debt instrument, on the grounds that you cannot legally encumber property whose title is itself in question. Fuentes argued it brilliantly, according to the letter he sent Jane, with the satisfied prose of a man who had just done exactly what he knew he could do. The ruling did not wipe out the debt entirely, but it forced a restructuring under court supervision, which removed Hale from the negotiation and required the debt to be sold to a legitimate lender at its actual face value, not the inflated amount Hale's interest had created. Jane paid the restructured debt, 3 years of careful cattle profits and the $200 Albert's loan had protected, and a small sale of the North Pasture's timber rights. And on a cold, bright morning in October 1886, she held a piece of paper in her hands that said the Grady Ranch was hers, free and clear. And she stood on her porch and looked out at the land and felt something she had not felt since the previous November. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but its precursor, the deep, steady, bone-level certainty that you are standing on ground that will not give way beneath you. Marcus Hale left Cimarron in the spring of 1887. The governor's investigation had made his operations too visible and too costly, and he had other enterprises in other territories that were less complicated. He went without drama, which was perhaps the most appropriate ending for a man whose villainy had been entirely made of paperwork and pressure. The families he had displaced did not come back, and that injustice was one that the law could not remedy, and Jane understood this and carried the knowledge of it soberly, as she carried many things. What came after the legal resolution was not the cautious, gradual progression you might expect from two careful and private people. What came after was Albert Carson standing at her gate one November morning, the 1-year anniversary of Thomas's death, and asking her to walk with him. They walked out to the south field, which was bare now in the late autumn, the corn harvested and the ground turned over in readiness for spring, the dark soil carrying the smell of everything that had grown there and everything that would grow there again. He stopped at the center of the field and turned to face her, and he said, without preamble and without nervousness, which she realized later was simply the confidence of a man who already knew the answer, "Jane Grady, I would like to marry you." She said, "Yes." He looked at her as if the answer had surprised him slightly despite his confidence. She said, "Did you expect me to say something else?" He said, "I expected you to think about it." She said, "I have been thinking about it since August." He almost laughed. He said, "So have I actually, since considerably before August." She took his hand and they stood in the middle of the turned field with the cold November sky above them, and the entire future ahead of them. And she felt the particular, extraordinary rightness of a life that has found its alignment after a long time out of true. They were married in December of 1886 in the Methodist Church in Cimarron, a small ceremony with Pete the ranch hand and Fuentes, who came from Santa Fe for the occasion, and the county clerk who had become an unlikely ally during the legal battle, and a handful of neighboring ranchers who had watched the whole drama and felt a kind of communal relief at its happy resolution. Jane wore a blue dress she had sewn herself from fabric ordered from the general store, and Albert wore the good suit he had kept in a cedar chest since his mother's funeral years before, and they were both serious and happy in the way of people who do not take good things lightly, because they have learned how quickly good things can turn. The minister asked if they would love and honor and remain faithful in sickness and in health, in hardship and in prosperity, and they both said yes with the authority of people who understood what those words actually meant when the ground shifted under you. They merged the two ranches not immediately but gradually, in the practical way that suited them both. The fence between the properties came down in the spring of 1887, which felt like a ceremony in itself, though neither of them treated it as such. Albert moved into the Grady house, which was larger, and they used the Carson house for the hired hands. The south field was planted that spring as it had been for 20 years, and Jane worked it beside Albert and learned the particular meditative quality of the work. The way planting required you to move at the land's pace rather than your own, and found it suited something in her she had not known needed suiting. The spring of 1887 also brought the first real indication of what they were building together beyond property lines and legal documents. Jane discovered in March that she was expecting their first child, and told Albert in the kitchen one morning while he was looking at his account books, in the same practical, direct way she did everything. He put down the account book and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she would keep for the rest of her life, the open, unguarded, radiant expression of a man in the full current of his own joy. He came around the table and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she let herself be held in the full warmth of it. And outside the kitchen window the south field was beginning to show the first green of the new corn, and the morning light was the particular gold of late spring, and the world was entirely present and entirely good. Their son was born in November of 1887, a healthy, loud, determined boy whom they named Thomas Albert Carson, Thomas for the man who had first claimed this land and Albert for the man who had stayed on it. And the naming felt right to both of them in a way that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. He was a dark-haired, strong-lunged infant who made his presence known from his first minutes in the world, and Jane held him in the bedroom while Albert sat beside her with his hand around hers, and there was no trace of anything but love in the room. Pete the ranch hand, who had stayed on through everything, and had become something between an employee and an uncle to the enterprise, declared the baby the finest thing he had seen in 30 years of ranch work, which was high praise from a man who had once said the same thing about an exceptional quarter horse. Young Thomas grew as children grow in ranch country, fast and practically, learning to walk in the same spring that Albert broke ground on an addition to the main house, learning to talk in the summer that they expanded the cattle operation to 400 head, learning to ride on the back of a patient old gelding in the autumn of his second year while his parents watched from the fence and Albert's arm was around Jane's shoulders, and the afternoon was golden and long. The years settled into a rhythm that was full and demanding and good. Jane took over the cattle management completely, a role that suited her organizational intelligence and her relationships with the buyers and brokers in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. Albert managed the crop side and the property maintenance, and the ongoing water rights negotiations that were always the particular preoccupation of ranchers in that dry country. They were equal partners in every sense that mattered, And if there were people in Cimarron who thought it unusual for a woman to run the cattle operation of a successful ranch, those people kept their opinions to themselves, because the evidence of the Carson Ranch's prosperity was not easily argued with. A daughter was born in 1890, whom they named Clara after Jane's mother, and she came into the world in early summer with a disposition entirely different from her brother's, calm and watchful and absolutely certain of her own importance from the first day, which made Albert say she had clearly inherited her mother's stubbornness, which made Jane say that stubbornness was the only reason either of them had a ranch to stand on, which Albert agreed was entirely true. Thomas, who was nearly 3 when Clara arrived, greeted his sister with solemn seriousness and spent the first week of her life sitting next to wherever she was placed and reporting to anyone who would listen that she was his sister, and she was very small. This was accurate. The south field was planted every spring without exception. Jane had come to love it the way Albert had always loved it, the ritual of the planting and the patience of the waiting and the particular satisfaction of the harvest. In the spring of 1891, when Clara was almost 1 and Thomas was 3 and the operation was at its most prosperous, Jane walked out into the south field in the early morning in the way she had come to do over the years, and Albert was already there in the way he always was, checking the first growth, reading the soil, doing the careful attending that farming required. She came and stood beside him, and they looked out at the field together, and she said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking about how different it looks now than it did when I was planting it alone." She said, "Better." He turned and looked at her with the same expression she had first seen in the barn doorway during the summer storm years ago, open and unguarded and entirely sure of itself. He said, "Better than anything I could have imagined when I started." She took his hand, and they stood in the field in the early light, and the corn was coming up green in the rows, and the children were still sleeping in the house, and the ranch was running well, and the land was secure and hers and his, and the debt was paid, and the enemy was gone, and the fence between them had been down for 4 years, and the morning was very quiet and very beautiful and very much their own. In the later years, the years when Thomas was old enough to ride the range with his father, and Clara was old enough to complain about the things she did not want to do and do them anyway, because her mother was not a woman who accepted avoidance of duty. Jane sometimes thought about the morning at the fence when Albert had said those words to her, and she had turned her horse and ridden away because she was not ready for the truth of them. She thought about the version of herself that had ridden away, and she was grateful for her, grateful for the fear and the grief and the self-protection that had been legitimate and necessary, grateful that she had taken the time she needed and not been rushed into anything by loneliness or desperation, or the practical advantages that remarriage might have offered her in that first terrible year. She had come to Albert Carson fully, with her grief finished and her independence intact and her land secure and herself complete, and she believed that this was the only way to come to someone if you wanted to build something that would last. She thought about Marcus Hale sometimes too, the trap he had set, and the patience and labor and fear it had cost to fight her way out of it, and she felt the injustice of the families he had displaced who had not had a Fuentes or an Albert or a stubborn streak and a faulty land title to fight back with. She did not resolve this feeling because it could not be resolved. What she did was make sure that the Carson Ranch was a good neighbor to everyone around it, that water access was shared fairly in dry years, that the land was worked in ways that did not exhaust what it had to give, and that people who came to them in difficulty were not turned away empty-handed. It was not justice, but it was something. Albert's South Field became something of a conversation between them over the years, a private language that required no translation. When things were difficult, one of them would go to the field and the other would find them there, and they would walk the rows together, and the walking itself was enough. When things were good, they went to the field to be grateful in the particular way that people who work with growing things know how to be grateful, quietly and with full attention. Their third child, A second son they named James arrived in 1893 when Jane was 34 and Albert was 40, and James was from his first breath the easiest of the three, placid and contented and interested in everything, the kind of child who sits and watches the world with large, satisfied eyes as if it is exactly what he expected, and he approves. Albert said James had inherited Jane's patience. Jane said Albert was confusing patience with stubbornness again. They were both right, as they usually were. Thomas at 6 was already learning to take on real responsibility around the ranch, carrying water and feeding the chickens, and following Pete through the morning chores with the earnestness of a child who has understood from watching his parents that work is not a punishment, but the substance of a good life. Clara at 3 was already insisting on doing everything herself and doing half of it spectacularly wrong and refusing all assistance, which again, Albert said, was Jane's fault. Jane said, "I consider it a compliment." Albert said, "It is." There was a period in the middle of the 1890s when the cattle market went through a rough patch, the national economy contracting in ways that reached all the way out to the ranches of New Mexico territory and squeezed the margins on beef prices, until you had to be very careful and very efficient to come through it with your operation intact. The Carson Ranch came through it because they had built the operation on a foundation of genuine financial discipline, and they had no debt and they had each other's judgment to lean on, and because Jane had built relationships with buyers in Albuquerque and Santa Fe who dealt with them on a preferential basis, because the Carson cattle were reliably excellent, and the Carson word was reliably kept. They were not unscathed. They pulled back the expansion plans for 1895 and held the cattle herd at the current size rather than growing it, and Albert took on the fencing and property maintenance himself without hiring extra hands for 2 seasons, and Jane took over the bookkeeping from their part-time bookkeeper and did it herself at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. These were not easy years, but they were good years in the way that difficult years can be good years when you face them with someone beside you who is equal to the facing. By 1897, the market had recovered and the Carson Ranch was expanding again, and Albert had taken on an additional 400 acres of grazing land to the north that had come available when an elderly rancher retired to live with his son in Colorado. The new land meant new infrastructure and new hands and new organizational demands, and Jane and Albert sat up late many nights at the kitchen table with maps and account books and coffee that went cold while they talked through the plans. And it was in these late-night sessions that Jane loved him most particularly, not in the romantic and obvious way, but in the deep and sustaining way, the way that comes from years of standing beside someone in the full reality of their shared life. Thomas, now 10, was showing the kind of natural aptitude for cattle work that made Albert quietly proud in the way he was proud of everything, without making a production of it. He had Thomas working with him on the range in a real capacity now, not just following along but contributing, and the relationship between father and son had the particular quality of 2 people who are genuinely compatible, who share a way of seeing things, who make each other better at what they do. Clara at 7 had decided that she was going to be a lawyer, inspired partly by the stories Jane had told her about Fuentes and the title case, and she conducted herself accordingly, which meant she argued every position with a ferocity that exhausted everyone around her, and also meant that she was nearly always right, which was the most exhausting part. Albert had written to Fuentes asking about legal education for women in New Mexico territory, and Fuentes had written back a detailed and encouraging letter that Clara had read 3 times and kept in the cedar box under her bed. James at 4 was still easy in content, which in a household containing Thomas and Clara was practically a survival adaptation. In the spring of 1898, Albert and Jane celebrated their 12th anniversary of the Southfield conversation, the morning she had gone to the fence with wire and pliers, and found him standing there with his hat in his hand, saying the truest thing he knew. They did not make a ceremony of it, which would not have suited either of them. What they did was go to the south field together in the early morning before the children were up, and walk the rows in the spring quiet and let the occasion be itself without decoration. Albert said, 29 seasons in this field now. Jane said, do you still mean what you said the 21st time? He stopped walking and looked at her and said, every single day. She leaned against him and his arm came around her, and they stood in the field in the early morning light with the corn beginning, and the whole season ahead of them, and the life they had built together surrounding them on every side. The children in the house and the cattle on the range and the fence posts in the ground and the water running clean in the creek and the mountains on the horizon and the sky above everything wide and blue and endless. She said, so do I. He kissed her temple and she closed her eyes and felt the 29 seasons of this field beneath her feet and the 12 years of their marriage in the air around them. And the 7 years before that when they had been neighbors who were slowly becoming something more without fully understanding it. And she understood that love of this kind is not a moment or a declaration but an accumulation, a planting and tending and harvesting repeated across years until it becomes the landscape itself. Until you cannot see the land without seeing the love in it, until the two are entirely the same thing. Later that morning after breakfast, while Albert was checking the north pasture, and Thomas was doing the morning chores, and Clara was reading at the kitchen table, and James was playing in the yard with the dogs, Jane stood on the porch of the house she had defended and saved and built into something beyond what Thomas Grady had originally imagined. And she looked out at the expanse of the Carson ranch in the spring morning, the fields and the range and the creek and the mountains beyond. And she felt full in a way that had nothing to do with any one good thing, and everything to do with the accumulated weight of many good things, the ordinary, extraordinary weight of a life that has been lived fully and loved well. She was 39 years old, and she was standing on her own land that she had fought for, beside the man she had earned the right to love by going through everything she had gone through, raising 3 children who were all entirely themselves, and therefore endlessly surprising, running an operation that was a genuine source of pride in the county. And she knew that the fence could come down because nothing between her and Albert needed dividing anymore. The South Field grew that year as it grew every year, patient and abundant and entirely unaware of its own significance. But Jane and Albert knew it, the way you know the things that have shaped you, the way you return to them in memory, and in fact and find them unchanged in their meaning though everything around them has changed. When Thomas was older and asked his mother how she had known that Albert was the right man, she told him the story of the fence and the field and the words that had been said on an early morning when she was not ready to hear them. She told him about the dry summer and the barn and the storm and the kitchen table and the months it had taken her to become ready. She told him that readiness was not something that came to you but something you built, the same way you built a cattle operation, the same way you built a family, one season at a time with patience and attention and the willingness to stay. Thomas listened to all of this seriously, the way he listened to most things, and then he said, "Were you scared?" Jane said, "Every day, for months." He said, "Were you glad you did it anyway?" She said, "Every day, for the rest of my life." He thought about this in the way of children who are actually thinking rather than performing the appearance of it, and then he said he understood, and she believed he did. The years moved through the turn of the century with the particular momentum of a life that has found its proper shape and is now occupying it fully. New Mexico territory was moving toward statehood, the political landscape of the West was changing, and the Carson Ranch adapted as it always had, with flexibility and financial prudence and the willingness to look at what was coming rather than what had been. In 1901, when James was 8, he decided with quiet certainty that he wanted to be a farmer rather than a cattleman, which surprised no one who had watched him following Albert through the South Field for years with an expression of total absorption. Albert was pleased in the deep, quiet way he was pleased by most things his children did, and began teaching James the particular art of the soil with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. Clara, at 11, was still entirely committed to the law, and she was reading everything she could find and writing letters to Fuentes in Santa Fe, who had become her long-distance mentor and correspondent, about territorial water rights and land title law, with an analytical sharpness that made Fuentes write back to Albert that the girl had a legal mind that would have been remarkable in anyone, and was practically incandescent given her age. Albert read this letter to Jane over breakfast, and they looked at each other across the table with the private and entirely unconcealed pride of parents who cannot quite believe that they have made a person this remarkable. Thomas, at 14, was riding the range with full authority, managing sections of the herd under Albert's supervision with a confidence that was earned rather than assumed, and he had his mother's eye for cattle quality and his father's patience with the land, and the combination was, everyone agreed, formidable. The house had been added onto twice by this point, and it was full in the way that good houses are full, with the accumulated life of the people who inhabit them, books and letters and children's boots, and the smell of coffee, and the particular creak of the porch boards at a specific temperature, and the way the afternoon light came through the west window and lay across the kitchen floor in a stripe that everyone stepped over without thinking about it. Albert still went to the south field every morning before the house was awake, and Jane still went with him most mornings when the children's demands permitted. They had stopped needing to talk much in those mornings, having arrived at the companionable silence of two people who know each other well enough to be quiet together without it meaning anything but ease. But sometimes he said things. Sometimes in the corn, in the blue early light, he said things that she collected and kept the way you keep the best things, carefully and privately. He said once, standing in the field in the autumn with the corn tall around them and the harvest beginning, "I used to think the restlessness would come back. Every few years I used to expect it, the need to be somewhere else, somewhere new. It never came back," she said. "What happened to it?" He said, "You did." She took his hand without looking at him because she did not need to look at him to know his face. In 1904, Fuentes wrote from Santa Fe to tell them that he had accepted Clara's application to read law with his firm in Santa Fe, which was the closest available option to a formal legal education for a young woman in New Mexico, and that she could begin when she was old enough. Clara, who was 14, received this news with the controlled satisfaction of someone who has expected nothing less, and is pleased but not surprised. She spent the remaining years at home preparing with a thoroughness that made everyone in the household slightly nervous. She left for Santa Fe in 1907, at 17, escorted by her father and her brother Thomas, who was now 20 and already running significant portions of the ranch operation. And Jane stood on the porch and watched the wagon take her daughter away toward her future, and felt the bittersweet fullness of a moment that is exactly right and also costs you something. Albert came and stood beside her, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and she said, "She is going to change things." He said, "I know," she said. "That's what I wanted for all of them." He said, "It's what you made possible, you and your refusal to let Hale have this land." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We made it possible." He kissed her hair. James stayed on the ranch as he had always intended, and in 1908 he was 17 and already managing the farming operation with a quiet competence that made Albert say he had taught James everything he knew and James had learned it all, and then improved on several of it, which James accepted with characteristic equanimity. Thomas married in 1909, a woman named Rose from a ranching family in the Pecos Valley, who was sturdy and good-natured and entirely unintimidated by the size of the Carson operation or by Jane, which Jane considered the most important qualification. They moved into the Carson house on the western side of the property, the house that had been Albert's original home, which had been maintained and improved over the years, and was now a proper family home waiting for exactly this purpose. Jane and Albert attended the wedding in Cimarron and danced together at the reception, and Albert was not a natural dancer, which had been established the first time they had danced together years before, but he was her dancer, and she had long since stopped needing him to be graceful about it. Clara wrote from Santa Fe that she was making progress on a case involving water rights for 3 families who had been displaced from their water access by a large land company, and that Fuentes was guiding her, and the case looked promising. She was 20 and she was changing things, exactly as Jane had known she would, and the knowledge of it was one of the best feelings Jane had ever felt. The South Field was planted in the spring of 1910, as it had been planted every spring for 32 years. Albert walked it in the morning as he always had, and Jane walked it beside him, and James sometimes came too, because the field was his now in every practical sense, and the 3 of them would walk the rows in the early light and talk about the soil and the weather and what was coming, and there was nothing complicated about it and nothing lacking. One morning in April of that spring, a morning very like the morning when everything had changed, Jane and Albert were in the field alone in the early light, and he stopped in the middle of the row and looked up at the sky, which was the clear, flat blue of a New Mexico spring morning, and then looked at her. He said, "Do you know what I am thinking?" She said. "Tell me." He said, "I am thinking that 32 springs is not enough, that I would like 32 more." She was 51 years old. She had gray in her dark hair and sun lines at the corners of her own eyes now, and her hands were the hands of a woman who had worked her whole adult life and not regretted one day of it. She was, she thought, the most entirely herself that she had ever been, more fully herself than the 19-year-old who had come west with Thomas, and more fully herself than the 27-year-old widow who had stood at the fence and listened to words she was not ready for. She said, 32 more would suit me perfectly." He smiled at her, the full, rare, entirely private smile that she had always understood was only for her, and they stood in the spring field, and the morning was entirely theirs, and the corn was beginning, and the future was long, and the love between them was as established as the soil under their feet, as patient as the seasons that had made it, as certain as the field that had first said its name out loud. The fence between their properties had been down for 24 years. The land was one piece now, legally and practically, the way they were one piece, having been made into it slowly and honestly by everything they had gone through together. The South Field went on being planted every spring, and every spring it mattered more than the spring before. That was the truth of it. That was the whole of it. That was the thing Albert Carson had known for 20 seasons before he was able to say it, and that Jane Grady had known since the morning she heard it, even when she was riding away in fear of its weight. You plant the same field every year, and it is not the same field. You love the same person every year, and it is not the same love. It grows, the way corn grows, slowly and entirely, until it is larger than you can see the edges of, and you stop trying to see the edges and simply stand in the middle of it and look up. The sky above them was blue and limitless. The field stretched in every direction, and they were in it together as they had been for so many seasons, as they would be for all the seasons still to come.